I'm Matthew Baddorf. Welcome to my recording for the 2021 Social Ontology Conference. Thanks for being here. This is my presentation in prep for the Q&A that we'll be having on this talk on Sunday, August the 15th. That's going to be at 4:20 Eastern Standard Time where I live. 8:20, I think, GMT. I'm afraid I didn't check to see what it is for Pacific time, but I trust that you guys can figure that out. I'm happy to see anybody who's interested there. Where you're watching this, you should probably take a look at the handout. It has a couple of thought experiments and overview of some of the key conclusions, so that might help you out. Also, my email address is on the handout. Please feel free to take a look at the paper if you would like. You can get a draft of the paper that this is based on by emailing me at the email there at the handout. It's more or less a finished draft, and I'm happy to send it to you if you're interested. Okay, so first off, the goal and some setup. So my goal here is just to sketch out what sort of reasons we have to punish collective entities, and to say a little bit about when those reasons are stronger and weaker. So to do that, I'm going to look at 3 standard justifications for individual punishment and try to see how they help. One interesting extension of the project would be to look at other justifications for individual punishment as well. So there are justifications for individual punishment like educative justifications, and I'm not going to have anything to say about them, but I'd be very curious to hear what folks in the Q&A have to say about them if you have thoughts. So a motivating concern here is that it's really important that we examine the reasons that we have for collective punishment carefully. Collective punishments almost always harm innocent individuals. So, for example, like if you impose some fine as a punishment on a corporation, then it's, likely that there will be innocent workers laid off or innocent investors who lose money, that sort of thing. So we need to have a good sense for how strong our reasons for collective punishment are. So before I get into the theories, just a couple of notes. Probably this terminology is not going to be totally alien to a lot of the folks here, but when I'm talking about collectives, I'm talking about organized groups that are capable of actions that are in some important way irreducible to the actions of individuals. And I'm interested in our reasons for punishing the collectives themselves, not just punishing the individuals that are parts of them or that are involved with them. And I'm particularly interested in our reasons for punishing collectives for wrongdoing that the collective had control over and is responsible for. Although it may well be that there are individuals who have control over and responsibility for individual actions that partially constitute the collective action. So some, crime syndicate might send some assassin, and it might turn out to be true that the assassin and the crime syndicate are both in some sense guilty for the same assassination. I'm not going to say anything about all the interesting metaphysical and ethical questions about collective moral responsibility that raises. I'm going to assume that we have some kind of account of that on which there's some sense in which the collective can be morally responsible in a way that isn't totally exhausted by the responsibility of the relevant individuals. Okay, the other thing is I'm going to talk about punishments. I don't really have an account of what it is to be a punishment, but I just want to note that a punishment is different from a mere sanction. So sanctions can be punishments, but they don't need to be. Sanctions are just legal or social penalties. I'll be interested in sort of both the legal and the non-legal sort of ways that we can sanction groups. But not all sanctions are punishments, and this is going to be relevant when it comes to looking at our first possible justification for collective punishment, deterrence. So deterrence is a nice place to start because a really standard story in the literature on collective moral responsibility goes something like this. Collective moral responsibility is important because we need to explain why collective punishment is justified. And collective punishment is seen as important because it's important for us to be able to deter collectives from bad behavior. So, you want to make sure that the corporations don't walk over everybody or something like that, right? And individual punishment might not provide collectives with enough deterrence. So I think deterrence has been seen as a really central kind of part of the story for why collective moral responsibility is important and for why collective punishment is justified. But I think this standard story suffers from a couple of problems. First off, sanctions inflicted for deterrence reasons are not necessarily punishments. So Baddorf and Kelly in their Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on punishment report that a desire to deter something from a behavior isn't enough to make some kind of sanction a punishment. My impression is that that's sort of fairly standard in the individual punishment literature. Hasness, writing about collective punishments, has noted that we can use exemplary damages, which don't require moral guilt, to deter corporations. So his thought is, we can do a lot of deterrence without having some kind of collective punishment regime. And I think this all makes good sense. We might have good reasons to sanction collectives, even when they don't have non-reductive moral responsibility or control. And that really suggests that if we are interested in particularly the question of collective punishment, well, we don't, for this sort of instances in which the collective does have some kind of non-reductive moral responsibility or control, we don't necessarily, sanctions themselves aren't necessarily getting us there. I also think it's important to note the other problem is that deterrence alone might not provide us with all that much reason for sanctioning collectives and for punishing them in particular. Remember, if we're going to punish, we need reasons that aren't just going to be defeated by the reasons that we have to avoid punishing. If you punish a collective, you're almost certainly going to harm individuals, innocent individuals. And that's really important. And it seems to me that if we're going to have a sort of a take stock of all of our reasons that we have for collective punishment, we got to look beyond deterrence. Okay, so if we want collective punishment and to know that we've got the full case for any given level of punishment, we need to look further than just deterrence. Okay, so that leads me to look beyond the sort of the standardly cited deterrence bit and look at a desert-based justification for punishment. So desert-based justifications for punishment are often called retributive, but that term is sometimes also used to refer to expressive justifications as well, which I'm going to talk about later. So I'm going to avoid the term retributive, but retributive might put you in sort of the headspace for what I'm thinking about here, because what I'm thinking about with desert-based justifications is the familiar but controversial idea that there's just something intrinsically right about making sure that the guilty suffer. So, this is kind of at least a justification of last resort for a lot of people when it comes to individual criminal punishment. Of course, a lot of people think that it doesn't make any sense. What I want to say here is even if it turns out that desert-based justifications work well for individual punishments, they provide us with very little reason for collective punishment. Okay, so to get you to be convinced of this claim, I want you to take a look at the two island cases that you can see in the handouts. We've got Island 1 and Island 2. I'll just read them out. So Island 1, this is based off of Kant's island murderer case. An island is about to be abandoned, with its few inhabitants dissolving their society and dispersing to the rest of the world. However, recently someone has been found to have been guilty of tax evasion. Damages for the lost tax revenue have been paid, but he could be punished with the destruction of some of the property he planned to take with him when he left. Okay, so that's an individual case. Since it's an island whose society is about to be dissolved, we're sort of leaving deterrence of future possible wrongdoers out of the picture. Let's take a look at Island 2, which is a collective version. So Island 2, an island is about to be abandoned, with its few inhabitants dissolving their society and dispersing to the rest of the world. In this case, however, there is something else guilty of tax evasion, an amateur art society. Damages for the lost tax revenue have been paid, but the society owns some art whose existence the society values and whose loss would frustrate its aims. The art could be destroyed as a means of punishing the society. And if you're worried about it doesn't seem right to sort of destroy artwork as a punishment, we could specify that it's really, really bad art if it would help. Okay, well, here's my intuition. Maybe, hopefully, you'll agree with me. Whether or not Island 1 gives us reason to punish in order that the guilty individual suffer. Island 2 doesn't give us reason, or doesn't give us much reason, or nearly as much reason to punish in order that the guilty art society suffer. It just seems to me when I compare those two situations, even when I'm in a kind of a more retributive frame of mind with regards to the individual in Island 1, it doesn't seem to me that we get much sort of desert-based justification for punishing the art society in Island 2. I can give you guys a couple of possible theoretical rationales for this intuition, both of which might end up being true. I think that thinking through the theoretical rationales can help to provide us with more support for this conclusion that the intuition is leading us to, this conclusion that desert-based justifications aren't really going to help here. So the first sort of possible theoretical rationale I want to suggest is this. Aptness for desert-based punishment requires aptness for agential anger, and collectives don't have that. So what I basically mean here is agential anger is this idea that I get from Shoemaker. It's this sort of moralized anger that demands an empathetic response from the person who's wronged us. So he distinguishes different senses of moral responsibility, and the agential anger sense, which I believe he calls accountability, requires that the sort of the person at the other end of it be able to respond in this empathetic way. I've argued previously that collectives aren't apt targets for agential anger. So the thought here is just maybe the reason that the Island 2 case doesn't seem, as compelling as the Island 1 case is because the sort of thing that the art society is, it's just not the sort of thing that's a good target for agential anger. It's not really an appropriate target in some sense. And because of that fact, it's less appropriate as a target for desert-based punishment. So that would fit with my own sort of perhaps very idiosyncratic views about collective moral responsibility. That's a possible justification. Here's a sort of more ecumenical justification that I think might appeal to more people. It might be that aptness for desert-based punishment requires phenomenal consciousness, that what it's like kind of consciousness. And collectives don't have that kind of consciousness. So I think it's probably pretty widely agreed that there's no what it is like to be General Motors, for example. And the thought here is that you need to have that sort of what it's like in order for this sort of this desert-based punishment to really be something that latches onto you. For it to really be the case that we have reason to punish you just in order to make you suffer because you did something bad, you have to be the sort of thing that can experience that suffering. I think that this is a plausible idea. If you think about, say, a thief who has died and then we discover that she stole a lot of money and she's left this money to her kids, well, we can take the money that she stole back and restore it to its rightful owners. But should we then go and have some desert-based reason to take more money from her estate just because we know that she wanted that money to go to her kids and we really want to sort of frustrate that desire? I don't think that we really get much desert-based justification to impose that extra punishment on the dead thief. And I think a plausible reason for that is, well, if you think that people who have died no longer have phenomenal experiences, then it seems like that provides a good explanation for why it is that we don't impose that punishment on the dead thief. Okay, well, so my own argument that collectives are not apt for agential anger rests on the idea that collectives lack phenomenal consciousness. So for me, at least, this second rationale is related to the first, but as I said before, I think it probably has more ecumenical appeal. So maybe you like one of those two rationales, or maybe both of them, but I think those sorts of possible explanations help to drive home the point that probably it turns out desert-based justifications don't do much to justify collective punishment. Maybe they do a little bit. On some days, I think maybe there's some room for a little bit of justification of collective punishment from that. But if there is, I don't think that there's very much. Okay, well, this leaves us with expressive justifications for collective punishment. And as you might guess, this is our winner. The idea here is that punishment is an important sort of social expression of our condemnation of wrongdoing. So I think that Primaratz, I'm afraid I don't quite know how to pronounce his name, but he has a nice way of putting this. He says, in talking about individual legal punishment, in expressing empathetic condemnation of the crime committed, punishment vindicates the law which has been broken, reaffirms the right which has been violated, and demonstrates that the misdeed was indeed a crime. So there are a number of different things that we could express by punishment, but I think that quote gives you a sense of sort of the variety of them. There's just something about punishing which can be an expression of commitment for the ideal that was broken by the punishee. And I think that this makes a lot of sense for individual punishment, both legal cases and non-legal cases. And it also, I think, makes a lot of sense for collective punishment. So in cases where collectives are capable of making decisions and giving accounts of those decisions, cases that Shoemaker has called answerability, I think we can use punishment to express our assessment of those decisions. So punishment can be an important means of expressing our societal judgment about the wrongdoing. Okay, so I think expressive justifications for punishment provide us with what our first two theories didn't. So huzzah, but also we find that there's a couple of interesting ways that the amount of reason we have to punish can vary. In particular, the amount of reason that we have to punish from our expressive reasons for punishing can vary. Okay, so first way it can vary, we have more expressive reason to punish when guilty individuals aren't guilty of wrongdoing as serious as the collectives. So to explain this, take a look at the first couple of ferry cases, ferry 1 and ferry 2. So I'll read out ferry 1. The herald of free enterprise sank, leading to the deaths of many people. The company was morally responsible for these deaths. It was in fact guilty of manslaughter due to its sloppy negligence with regard to safety precautions. The individuals involved, while guilty of various lesser offenses, were not guilty of anything as serious. Okay, then let's take a look at ferry 2. The announcer of free enterprise sinks, leading to the deaths of many people. Its case is just like that of the herald, with this difference. In this case, the individuals were actually negligent in such ways as to be guilty of manslaughter themselves, and all guilty individuals were punished appropriately. The company, however, was still guilty of manslaughter, but is not punished. So here is my sense. I think expressing our condemnation of the collective wrongdoing is more important in ferry 1 case than in the ferry 2 case. We get more expression-based reasons to punish in ferry 1 than we do in ferry 2. Why is this? Well, Philip Pettit considers ferry 1 in some of his own work, and he seems to think, he doesn't think about the ferry 2 case, but when he's thinking about ferry 1, he suggests that deterrence is the reason. And there certainly may well be a lot of deterrent, related reasons to sanction the herald of free enterprise in that case. But I think the contrast with ferry 2 shows that we want more than just the deterrence. We most want to punish collectives when their wrongdoing is significantly worse than the individual acts that help constitute it. So the idea here is manslaughter is really bad. We have a collection of individual actions that help to constitute this collective action of manslaughter in both cases. But in the second case, we have expressed our societal disdain for those actions by convicting individuals of manslaughter, convicting them of manslaughter of the very same people that the free enterprise is guilty of manslaughtering, if that's a verb. Anyway, whereas in ferry 1 case, when we're taking a look at that case, the individuals have been convicted of lesser offenses, but there hasn't been any social sort of statement about the seriousness of manslaughter because none of the individuals were convicted of anything nearly as serious. So it seems to me that kind of case is one where we have more social reason to express our, our criticism of the free enterprise than we do in ferry 2. Okay, so I think we get more reason to punish collectives when the relevantly guilty individuals aren't guilty of anything as serious as the collective is. And I think that thinking about expressive justifications for punishment can help us to see why. Okay, so the other way that our expressive reasons to punish can vary is this. We have more expressive reason to punish the more guilty individuals have avoided punishment. So for this, take a look at ferry 3. So I'll read it out. Ferry 3, this case is just like ferry 2, save for the fact that in this case, the individuals were not punished for their wrongdoing. These individuals would not be harmed by any collective punishment inflicted on the ferry company. Perhaps they left its employment and have adopted new identities to prevent any social backlash from their actions. So here we also have, we're stipulating a morally responsible company, the free enterprise. We're also stipulating that we've got these individuals whose actions partially constituted the free enterprise's action, and their actions also were themselves instances of manslaughter. Okay, but in this case, basically the individuals got away with it, and there's nothing we can say that we can do about that now. I have this sense. We've got more reason to punish the collective in the ferry 3 case than in the ferry 2 case. And why is this? Well, it's plausible that it isn't just for deterrence reasons. The fact that individuals have escaped judgment for their individual actions makes it more important that we punish the collective whose action their individual actions partially constituted. So basically the idea here is a bit as with the ferry 1 case, we haven't expressed a social judgment about the manslaughter involved because, well, at least we haven't expressed a legal one, because nobody's been convicted of manslaughter. And so the fact that some individuals got away with the manslaughter suggests that the company, which is guilty of manslaughtering the same innocent people, it's more important that we hold the company to account in this kind of case. So I think that those are a couple of different ways that are interesting that expressive justifications for punishment can illuminate when we've got more reason to take that terrible risk of harming innocent people through a collective punishment, and when we don't. So in conclusion, I think that expressive reasons for punishment provide us with what we need, significant reason for punishing, not just sanctioning collectives, and some guidance about when is it important enough to punish collectives and worth the downsides. Thank you very much.